Dear listeners, welcome to the Deep Journal channel. By subscribing to our channel, you can be informed about detailed reports every time. While the tension between Israel and Iran grows day by day, Israel's attacks on Iran-backed militants in Syria continue unabated. During the day, Israel carried out heavy airstrikes against Iran-backed Hezbollah militants in southern Syria from the Golan Heights. According to the Syrian state news agency, Syrian air defense systems intercepted all the missiles, but could not later deny that one of the Hezbollah militants was killed. In some media organs, it is thought that the person who died as a result of the attack was a soldier affiliated with the Syrian regime forces. On Thursday night, 4 Israeli F-16 jets rained missiles over the Golan Heights at Iranian arms depots near Damascus airport. It was also reported that the target of the attack were Russian-made air defense system batteries. We will examine all the details of the attack shortly. At the beginning of November, Israel announced that the USA had completely lost its pressure on Iran as a result of the meeting between President Bennett and President Biden, and announced that it would do its own work, and then carried out many non-stop airstrikes. Israel did not let the Iranian-backed militants in the region by hitting the Iranian-backed militant headquarters in many different regions, especially in the south of Syria, including Damascus. Another factor in these attacks was the agreements made between Russia and Israel. As a result of the agreement that came out of the Putin and Bennett meeting in Moscow, Russia said that it would not prevent Israeli airstrikes. In the agreements, which underlined that the attacks it could not prevent were land-to-land attacks, Israel gained a great strength and Russia turned its back on Iran, one of its biggest allies. The air raids, which have been increasing since then, have been carried out especially over the Golan Heights. In these attacks, the headquarters of Iranian-backed militants and many air takeoff areas belonging to the regime forces were hit near the Golan Heights, while many delivery points identified by intelligence reports in Damascus and the southern part of the country were also destroyed. In many of the attacks, although Syrian local media claimed that they destroyed most of the Israeli missiles, local sources generally said otherwise. Similar incidents took place in the airstrike that took place today. Missile salvos were sent from the Golan Heights to the nests of Iranian-backed militants stationed in areas close to the Israeli border in southern Syria. In the attacks, in which many missiles were used, some missiles hit their targets with full accuracy, according to information provided by local military sources. On the other hand, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz said in a statement yesterday that no one could predict how much a possible war situation between Israel and Iran would cost the country. The possibility of a war with Iran came to the fore as a result of the IDF's exercises for weeks and the scenarios of war preparation it carried out with allied countries. Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz, on the other hand, did not speak definitively about these war rumors, but underlined that the bill of a war between Israel and Iran is still unclear. Currently, Hezbollah militants are estimated to have more than 120,000 missiles. At the same time, the U.S. media reported that Israel carried out attacks on chemical weapons facilities in Syria, according to a report released today. This news fell like a bomb on the agenda. It was said that the chemical weapons activities that are being carried out secretly in Israel with each passing day were deciphered by intelligence reports and then shot down by the IDF with point shootings. Let's examine the details of the airstrike carried out by Israel's F-16s today and the consequences of the war between Israel and Iran. Israeli missiles struck areas in southern Syria, killing one regime soldier and causing some damage, Syrian state news claimed early Thursday. A Syrian military official said the airstrikes took place just before 1 a.m., with the missiles coming from the Golan Heights, striking areas in the south of the country, Syria's state-run news agency reported. It did not specify what was targeted. The military official added that most of the incoming missiles were intercepted by Syrian air defenses, an oft-heard claim that most Syrian war analysts regard as a false, empty boast. There was no immediate comment from Israel, which does not discuss individual airstrikes in Syria as a matter of policy. Israeli Housing Minister Ze'ev Elkin refused to comment on the specific strike, but reiterated Israel's policy of blocking Iranian entrenchment, weapons transfers and the establishment of a front against Israel on the Golan Heights. Russian military sources claimed the attacks took place near the Damascus airport, a common target for alleged Israeli strikes seeking to thwart Iranian weapons shipments. The alleged bombing was the first since a highly unusual strike on the port in Latakia last week, in which Israel was believed to have targeted a shipment of advanced Iranian weapons. Following that strike, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett told a press conference that, "We're pushing back on the bad forces of this region day and night. We won't stop for 1 second." This happens almost daily. Russian news agencies, citing a Russian military official, said Syrian armed forces destroyed most of missiles fired by Israeli F-16 fighter jets towards targets in the region of the Damascus airport. Rear Admiral Vadim Kulit was quoted as saying that a warehouse was damaged and 1 man was killed by the airstrike in the early hours of Thursday. He said 4 F-16 Israeli fighter jets launched the cruise missile strike from the Golan Heights. Israel has mounted frequent attacks against what it has described as Iranian targets in Syria, where Tehran-backed forces including Lebanon's Hezbollah have deployed over the last decade to support President Bashar al-Assad in Syria's war, but rarely acknowledges or discusses such operations. Many of the strikes in the past had targeted the main airport in the capital Damascus, through which Iran is also believed to transfer advanced arms to its proxies. This week Defense Minister Benny Gantz has directed the Israel Defense Forces to prepare for a military option against Iran. The army has gotten an extra $5 billion to equip and train for the day. Israel has held discussions with the Biden administration on military cooperation. All that's left to arrange is the problem of preparing the Israeli population for an inevitable Iranian retaliation. The only statistic that we have to work with is one that former Prime Minister Ehud Barak made public a decade ago, namely that the number of fatalities would be fewer than 500 and that experts working for the IDF pegged the figure at the inconsequential figure of about 300 dead. They told us that the figure was based on the number of missiles Iran had at the time, its launch capabilities, the warning times that the IDF would be capable of giving civilians and the missiles' lack of precision. In the meantime, the number of missiles Iran can deploy has certainly grown. But by how much? Have their targeting and destructive capacity been enhanced? Will those unfortunate fatalities be mainly in Israel's outlying areas? In the major cities? Do the numbers perhaps need to be revised? In truth, because even in regard to Hezbollah, about whom we would hope the intelligence we possess is more accurate, the number of missiles in its possession is estimated at between 120,000 and 150,000. That is a number Israel is not prepared for. A country like Israel about to enter a war would expect its citizens to panic, to carefully inspect the condition of their shelters, try on gas masks, empty the supermarket shelves and get their hands on airline tickets to anywhere else in the world, even COVID hotspots. Such a country's government would have been expected to hold nationwide civil defense drills, rehearsing civilian evacuations. Hospitals would be preparing to cope with mass casualties. Schools would be required to rehearse their students heading to the shelters in a quick and orderly fashion. Public service television broadcasts would be explaining where to gather, what to do and how to take cover. Strangely enough, none of this is happening. That's either because the government doesn't really intend to make good on its threat and so there's no need to prepare for Iranian retaliation, or the government doesn't think that defending the country from an existential Iranian threat includes protecting its citizens. Ordinary Israelis are regarded as collateral damage. Because even if it involves 300 or 500 or 5,000 dead, after all, the homeland is more important than its citizens. If Israel choose to ignore the fatality estimates because there are no numbers can really rely on, the next question is how long the fighting might last. In the most optimistic scenario, Israel dispatches a few jet fighter squadrons to Iran to bomb a handful of nuclear sites and, in turn, sustains such and such fatalities in an Iranian retaliatory attack and that's the end of it. It's a matter of a few days. But what if Iran decides to continue firing missiles at us, bring Hezbollah's missile arsenal into the conflict and/or paralyze Persian Gulf shipping even after the Israeli fighter planes have returned safely home? Would the Israeli economy be able to sustain the damage? Would the United States continue to stand by Israel's side after it had been defied? Israel is unable to wage long wars, even when it has international support. A war of attrition against Iran, even if it doesn't cause an unbearable loss of life, would require huge amounts of money, inflict major damage on the quality of life and require emergency tax increases. Israel's citizens have not been shown any forecasts that predict the scope of the damage and losses that they should be expect in such a scenario. They are being asked to believe not only that the Iranian threat is real but also to count on the government being prepared for any scenario, just as it was in the case of the coronavirus pandemic.